Hello, and welcome to the CV Tech Quick Chat with Pre-Pass Safety Alliance. We encourage you to engage in the session and each other by asking any questions within the chat box on your right. Today's presenter is Mark Doughty. Mark is the President and CEO of Pre-Pass Safety Alliance. Mark's full bio can be found by clicking on the speaker's name below the video. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mark.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Christine. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Oh, always. We're so happy to have you. So, as Pre-Pass has pointed out, commercial vehicle enforcement is evolving to take advantage of new technology, just as the trucking industry is doing, specifically when it comes to universal ID concept proposed by Fmcsa. Actually, it's the universal ID concept proposed by CVSA, not Fmcsa.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, yes, sorry about that. So my first question for you is, can you provide an overview of how universal identification, known as UID for short, would work, including telling us who is leading the charge for it and what technology would be used to broadcast this data to enforcement?
All right, so we get a multi-part question right out of the gate. I like that. Let me break it down into a couple of smaller answers if I could. So first, who's leading the charge? Universal ID is actually not a new issue. It's nearly a quarter century old. It dates back to 1999. Federal Highway Administration actually funded a needs assessment to determine the feasibility of putting an electronic identifier on every truck. So obviously it has a long history. A couple other stopping points along the way. In 2009, CVSA actually petitioned the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, I'll refer to them as FMCSA throughout, for a UID approval, which it was ultimately denied in 2013. So since then, CVSA has continued to pursue various avenues to gain approval for UID, all of which have been unsuccessful to date. So that's who's leading the charge. Now we'll talk about some of the technology. So initially the goal was to have a common data point used to identify all trucks, something like a vehicle identification number, commonly referred to as a VIN, which could be handled by a transponder similar to those used in today's tolling and bypass systems. But as you can imagine, as time has continued to go on, technology's advanced. So the goal of CVSA and FMCSA has evolved as well. And now it's looking more like they're seeking to broadcast the UID information through systems probably like cellular, Bluetooth, or dedicated short-range communication. So although the initial goal was a single data point, both CVSA and FMCSA today have indicated the bigger picture is to collect additional information. That would include driver information, vehicle information, carrier data, et cetera. But I would comment regarding that, and as you can already see, it's kind of grown in scope from a single point to much larger. There are folks that have concerns about that, many groups that have opposed UID for several reasons. And I would say chief among them is being a cost burden for both industry as well as the states. And then there's the ever-growing concerns about data privacy. And I think those two concerns were valid dating back to 1999, and I think there are still level of those concerns today.
Yeah, so UID almost became a reality in the infrastructure bill that was signed into law late last year. So should we consider this a next generation license plate, or does it evolve more than that?
I would say I don't see this as the next license plate. And that's as CVSA and FMCSA have stated. Again, they're seeking more data than just being able to identify the vehicle. I think if it was just like the VIN number, that's possible, but given the scope of information they've expressed they're after, I don't think so. Again, the Alliance, FMCSA, CVSA, we all share a mutual goal of reducing truck crashes and especially improving overall highway safety. However, we believe that gathering additional data is only part of the solution. What hasn't been discussed, and from my perspective is not being discussed, at least not from what we've heard, what do you do with all of the data? What is the benefit going to be for industry for providing the data? And following up on that, I think one point of interest is that, the current push for UID would only apply to vehicles manufactured after the implementation. So think about that. There'd be no requirement for the millions of commercial vehicles currently in service. So this would create an unlevel playing field, as new trucks would be under additional scrutiny from enforcement, while aging vehicles, which we know from our own program are more likely to have safety issues, would not. So if this were just about safety, my question is, shouldn't all vehicles that require more attention be the priority, not just new vehicles?
So what do you feel is driving these initiatives?
Great question. You often hear statements like data is the new gold, the new oil, whatever, I guess in this world, the new, electronic vehicle technology. So the demand for data is always driving these initiatives. And I would say, like the Alliance, all parties involved, they have a desire to improve highway safety. And I think that's important to know. This is really about highway safety, but how do we get there? And currently the percentage of trucks that are inspected at roadside is very small. And the agencies responsible for those activities want to increase the number of inspections. But I would also say there's a challenge that simply gathering more data does not translate into improved safety. So there needs to be a plan with clearly defined safety outcomes that support gathering this additional data. Another point I would bring up, and I think we're all very much aware, and that's the advancements in the autonomous trucks. With those trucks, and as we start to move into level 4 and level 5, we don't know when, but I think it's a matter of time, that there's going to be a need for new inspection methods. A truck without a driver raises a variety of issues that need to be resolved. There's discussions about an enhanced pre and post-trip inspection, talks about maybe Fmcsa certified personnel would be one approach to be considered. However, we believe there still needs to be some type of a random inspection, similar to what is used in today's way station bypass programs, such as pre-pass. One of the things I would share is carriers have been very vocal that the random inspection helps to drive out complacency in their own operations. In addition, having a random inspection would help to address potential risks that may be associated with illegal activities such as human and drug trafficking, where if you don't have a driver in that vehicle and you're not doing random inspections, might that attract those types of activities, which would be of great concern to everybody.
Yeah, so I'd like to circle back to some of the points that you made a little earlier on in our discussion about the data and the security of that data. So has anyone from FMCSA worked with the trucking industry to address concerns over the amount and security of data and how it will be used?
Yeah, again, great question, and always on top of mind. There have been wireless roadside inspection studies dating back to around 2010, but nothing specific to UID to my knowledge. I will say that with FMCSA's recent notice that they'll be putting out either an ANPRM or an NPRM, again, enough with the acronyms, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on UID, this process is in the beginning stages. I would say, I think it's important to create an awareness in the trucking industry about this next generation of data gathering technology and how it may be used. The industry needs to be educated. Again, they need to be informed, and by all means, weigh in on any new mandates requiring them to provide additional data.
So what are some of the unanswered questions about level 8 inspections for the trucking industry?
Yeah, so this approach to UID takes a really big step towards transferring enormous amounts of data on both commercial and proprietary from the trucking companies directly to state and federal governments. So UID, or wireless roadside inspection technology, would create a real-time wireless connection between a truck's onboard computer and state agencies that are involved from an enforcement perspective. So I think the first question that must be answered is, how is the government going to use that information? How exactly will UID improve highway safety? Without a clear vision and direction, some might say this seems like a solution looking for a problem rather than a solution that's addressing a very specific problem. So I think that's important. Some other questions that I think need to be answered also include what data is going to be transmitted, and who will receive it. What if the data received by the state leads to an out of service violation for a truck? Again, that's important. We want to identify those trucks. But I would also say, truck parking is just such a huge issue right now. And there's a lot of issues. So if there aren't plans from a trickle down approach that says, okay, we're identifying more trucks that are out of service, but where do we park them? How do we park them safely until the issue is resolved? I think the last thing we want to do is to address one issue on a safety platform and create other unintended issues that we can't properly address. And then, a third point I would bring up is how will the carriers benefit from this new request for data? So, we always bring this up because historically speaking, if you think back to 2015, the FAST Act had a provision called Beyond Compliance. This program called on Fmcsa to credit carriers who voluntarily install advanced safety equipment, use enhanced driver fitness measures, adopt fleet safety management tools and technologies and programs. However, the problem is here we are 7 years later, and it still hasn't come to fruition, and nobody has come to the table with ideas to do so. So I think it's important that we have both sides participating, that if it makes sense for industry to provide the information, that they also receive the credit for doing so, and that there's benefit to industry. For those carriers that are running really good, clean operations, they receive credits and not just what we would call demerits for the bad performance, but credits for the good performance.
Yeah, so in your estimation, how soon could we start seeing this? Maybe a couple of years, or do you think it's many years away?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opinions there. As I think you've heard me say, there's a lot of questions yet to be answered, and it's going to take time to resolve. I personally believe it could take many years. I know others think it'll be sooner. I believe the Alliance, CVSA, and the federal government will have a vision of how inspections will be conducted in the future. But the volume of trucks on the road today is it's beyond the capacity of existing technology. So things do need to evolve. I would comment one thing that may speed this up is, the recent passage of IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's a lot of money that's going to be put out by the government, and I think the funding could go a long way for UID type of efforts. But, I keep in mind that you put that out there, the states are all going to need money to build out systems in order to communicate with the trucks, display the results of that information for enforcement personnel so that they can properly address issues. And that's great because you build the system. But as we know, just looking at, say, for instance, our highway systems, costs of maintenance need to be updated. And in the case of compliance for our trucks, there's staffing involved. And so you get a good batch of IIJA money, but how long will it last? And I can say from our perspective, we're coming into our 30th year in our program. The cost to build out infrastructure to support UID in all 50 states, I would estimate would run into the billions of dollars. So we'll see how that impacts it. And I would also say the reality is states already have programs such as pre-pass and others that enable safe, qualified carriers to bypass weigh stations today. That in turn helps roadside enforcement to focus on trucks requiring more attention. And I would say programs like ours, they're provided to the states at no cost. And they've continued to evolve based on the state's requirements. So I would conclude with, I'm really confident with collaborative efforts that we'll be able to make the right changes working with CVSA and Fmcsa to chart what I would say is the best path forward. I think there's a way forward. I just think that the collaboration and the utilization of the systems we have and building upon those is, in our opinion, what we would say is the best path forward. And not just best from our perspective, but also for the taxpayer. Because we already have a shortage of funding out there, and working with organizations like ours and others, we do this at no cost to the taxpayer. And I think that's an important point to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. So thank you again very much.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you for inviting us back. We really appreciate it.
Of course, anytime. And just a reminder that today's session will be available here within the CV Tech event platform for the next 3 months. On behalf of the CV Tech event and our sponsor, Pre-Pass Safety Alliance, we would like to thank you all for joining us today.